Imagine this. A crisis hits your organization. Could be anything, right? A big cyber attack, maybe an operational failure, even something like a flood or a storm.
Yeah, something unexpected throws everything sideways.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Are you ready? I mean, really ready. Not just having some binder on a shelf somewhere, but do you have a plan your team actually knows? And maybe the most important bit, have you ever practiced that plan when things feel real?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That gap between the plan on paper and, actually being able to pull it off when everything's hitting the fan, that's huge.
It really is. And that's where we're diving in today. We're looking hard at how organizations get past just having a plan to being genuinely resilient when stuff goes wrong.
We've got some interesting stuff to look at. Guides on simulations, tabletop exercises.
And a really detailed look inside the actual security setup of a digital infrastructure company. So our mission today, unpack the steps organizations take to get ready, understand the kind of bedrock security and operations that make it all possible, and see how that planning actually gets tested in practice.
Yeah, looking at the mechanics, how strategy meets the technical details.
And this whole exploration into preparedness and security resilience, well, it's made possible by our sponsor, www.cisomarketplace.com. We'll tell you a bit more about them later on.
Okay, so let's get into this material. Let's see what it means for you, our listener, whether you're, keeping systems up, protecting data, or just curious about what makes an organization, tough.
Right. Let's kick things off with actually testing those plans. Our sources, like the ones from Prevention Web and PreparedX, they talk a lot about simulation exercises, CIMEX, and tabletop exercises, TTX. What exactly are these?
Well, fundamentally, CIMEX and TTX are ways to be proactive. Emergency managers, companies, they use them to not just read the plan, but to kind of live it for a bit.
Okay.
They're controlled settings designed to put systems, procedures, contingency plans, how people respond, even equipment through their paces. Think of it like a dress rehearsal for a disaster.
A dress rehearsal. I like that. But why is that step so vital? Isn't having a really well thought out plan enough sometimes?
Well, one of our sources, PAHO, actually says simulations and drills are pretty much the most effective way to really evaluate and test disaster plans.
The most effective. Wow.
Yeah, because writing it down is one thing, right? But the simulation shows you if people actually get their roles when things are moving fast, if communication works under pressure, if the procedures even make sense when you try to apply them. Do people know where the tools are? Does the tech work?
Mm-hmm.
And what you find out directly feeds back into making your actual preparedness better.
Okay, so it's like reading the manual for putting together IKEA furniture versus actually trying to build the thing. The practice shows you where the instructions are confusing or you're missing a screw.
Exactly that. And, there isn't just one kind of exercise. Prevention Web mentions a few types. Drills, tabletop exercises, TTX, functional exercises, and the big ones, field or full-scale exercises.
What's the big difference between those?
Mostly it boils down to realism and resources. How real do you need it to feel, and how much time and money can you throw at it? A TTX is usually like the lowest on both scales. Often it's just key people in a room talking through a scenario step by step. Minimal resources, lower realism maybe.
Right.
A full-scale or field exercise, that's the other end. Maximum realism might involve multiple departments, maybe outside agencies, actually deploying equipment, operating in the real environment, or something close to it. It's resource intensive.
So functional exercises somewhere in between.
Yeah, it tests specific functions, coordination, communication, but maybe without everyone going out into the field. The goals you set really determine which type of exercise makes the most sense.
Makes sense. You wouldn't call it the fire department just to test an internal email alert, right?
Exactly. So how do you actually build one of these things? Prevention Web lays out a process, kind of like 4 main phases. Phase 1 is initiation. This is all the prep work before the exercise.
Setting the stage.
Yeah.
So defining your goals clearly, what specific plans or skills are you actually testing? That helps you pick the right type of exercise.
And who needs to be there?
Right. Defining the audience. Who needs to participate? And thinking about stakeholders, too. Maybe vulnerable groups. Considering accessibility needs right from the get-go.
You also need a team to actually run the thing.
Absolutely. A facilitation team, a lead, someone technical, someone handling logistics, the event coordinator, maybe some assistants. This team puts together a concept note, basically the blueprint. Goals, outcomes, resources, timeline. Then send out the invites, making sure there's info on accessibility support.
Okay, phase 2, design. This is where you actually build the exercise.
This starts with scenario development. You craft a story, a master scenario based on risks you've identified or the plans you're testing. The key is making sure the scenario forces people to use the procedures or make the decisions you want to test.
It needs to link the objectives to what actually happens in the exercise.
Then there's the logistics and documentation piece. This sounds like a lot of work.
It can be. Preparing the location, making sure it's safe and accessible, getting supplies, arranging translation if needed, equipment checks, and then the key documents. The master scenario itself, an inject matrix.
Ah, the inject matrix. That sounds important.
It is. It's the list of specific updates or problems you'll feed into the exercise. Like, okay, at 10:25 a.m., this system fails, or a news report just broke about this. It keeps the scenario moving, plus the overall exercise plan.
Got it. So phase 3 is implementation, game day.
Pretty much. Participants get briefed on the scenario, their roles. Then the facilitation team takes over.
They run the show.
The lead facilitator guides things. Assistants deliver those injects according to the plan, or maybe adapting on the fly based on how things are going. They're watching how participants react, what decisions they make, what actions they take. They might even role-play external people, like the media or regulators.
So they're not just watching, they're actively poking the simulation to see what happens.
Exactly. They want to see how the team handles the pressure, follows the plan, or maybe comes up with creative solutions when the plan doesn't quite fit.
Okay, and the last phase, phase 4, follow-up, where the learning happens.
Starts with a debriefing. Everyone shares their experience, participants, facilitators, what worked, what didn't, how did it feel. It's crucial because someone in the exercise might see things very differently than an observer.
Capturing all those perspectives.
Yeah.
And the point of the debrief is?
The action plan. This is the critical output. You take the lessons learned, the gaps you found, and turn them into concrete actions. Prepared X really emphasizes this. Prioritize the findings, give someone ownership for fixing each issue, set deadlines, and maybe even plan the next exercise to check if the fixes worked.
That makes sense. Paradex also mentioned using extra materials for realism.
Yeah, things like mock press releases, fake social media updates, simulated angry customer emails, even short video clips like mock news reports. It just helps people feel the pressure and immerse themselves more fully.
So let's bring this back to you, listening in. Why should you care about all the nuts and bolts of running these simulations?
Well, because understanding this process, it shows you the kind of deliberate effort needed to go from just having a theory to actually being capable. Whether you might be in one or help plan one, or maybe you just rely on an organization getting it right in a crisis. Knowing this shows that readiness isn't luck. It's built through structured, intentional practice.
Right. It kind of demystifies how organizations build that muscle memory for when things go wrong.
Exactly.
Okay, testing the plan is clearly vital. But like you said, those plans depend on the underlying systems and processes being solid in the first place. Secure, reliable.
So let's shift gears. Let's look at those foundational bits, the security controls and operational practices. We can do that by digging into this U.S. Signal SOC2 report.
Right. This gives us a real-world example. A SOC2 report essentially audits how a service provider manages data to protect organizational interests and client privacy based on specific trust service criteria.
And U.S. Signal, who are they quickly? They're a digital infrastructure company. They offer network stuff, cloud, colocation, data protection, security, DR, powered by their own fiber network. The report notes they got acquired by Igneo Infrastructure Partners back in Feb 2023, but they still operate independently.
Okay. And this report covers mid-2023 to mid-2024.
Yeah, July 2023 to June 2024. And importantly, it says they didn't find any system incidents during that time that stopped them from meeting their service commitments.
That sounds pretty good. Suggests things are working. One of the first things the report mentions is leadership responsibility. Seems key.
Absolutely fundamental. The report makes it clear executive leadership and the board are ultimately responsible for the whole information security program. And the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, plays a critical role.
How so?
The CISO advises leadership, helps set priorities for policies based on risk, guides the actual security and availability efforts day to day, and reports directly up to both the execs and the board.
So security has a seat at the main table.
Exactly. And the board provides that independent oversight, separate from the daily management.
That commitment then gets translated into actual policies and procedures, right?
Yep. The report mentions documented policies, things like business conduct, InfoSec, data protection.
The rule book.
The rule book. And it's not just written and forgotten. They review and update these policies annually, get them approved by the CISO or top management, and employees have to acknowledge them when they start and every year after that. Plus, Mandatory annual security awareness training. Policies only work if people know about them.
Makes sense. How do they handle risk management?
They do an annual risk assessment. They look for threats, figure out the potential impact, and decide how to mitigate those risks. Management links specific risks to the controls meant to address them, and they review how that's going every quarter. The CISO also keeps an IT roadmap, probably to make sure security investments line up with the risks they've identified.
Okay, let's get into some specific controls mentioned. Logical access. Who can get into what systems?
Yeah, this is basic but crucial. They keep customer data separate using virtual setups, firewalls at the edges, and between internal network zones. Access itself is controlled using systems like Radios and Active Directory, unique user IDs, strong password rules enforced.
And what about when people join, leave, or change roles? Managing that access.
Super important. They have documented processes for setting up access, provisioning, and removing it, deprovisioning, based on roles and requests. And privileged access admin rights is tightly controlled, limited to specific people, and management actually reviews who has that access every quarter to make sure it's still needed.
Okay. What about physical access? Getting into the buildings, the data centers?
Also tightly controlled. Electronic proximity cards, sometimes biometrics, to get into corporate HQs and the data centers themselves. Cameras and alarm systems are monitored 24/7 by their TOC Technical Operations Center. And just like logical access, they review the physical access logs quarterly.
Makes sense. Data protection and encryption are obviously big ones too.
Definitely. They use WPA2 for wireless security. There's a policy against sending sensitive data unencrypted over public networks. They use DLP data loss prevention tools to scan outgoing stuff and potentially block sensitive info from leaving, and employee workstations and laptops. BitLocker encryption on the drives and any removable media plugged in.
Okay, shifting to system operations. What keeps things running reliably and securely?
Regular checkups. Vulnerability scans, both internal and external, at least quarterly. Annual network segmentation tests and penetration tests, crucially, with a process to track and fix any critical or high-risk findings.
So they don't just find problems, they make sure they get fixed.
Right. They log security events and alerts into a SIEM, that's a Security Information and Event Management System, in their NMS network management system. That's monitored in real time by the TOC. They audit firewall rules twice a year, and if something does go wrong, an incident happens, they do a root cause analysis afterward to figure out why and stop it from happening again.
Change management is always a tricky one. Making changes without breaking things.
Yeah, they have a formal process for that, guided by their data protection policy. Big things are keeping development and staging separate from production. Management reviews proposed changes weekly. Changes are documented in tickets. Code changes get peer-reviewed. Business testing happens before deployment. And only specific people have the access to actually push changes live.
Sounds like a lot of checks and balances. Any other risk mitigation strategies mentioned?
Yes. They use insurance, which helps manage the financial side of potential incidents, and they have a vendor management process doing due diligence on new vendors and annually for high-risk ones, making sure their suppliers are also secure.
And the bedrock of availability, backups, and recovery.
Critical. Redundancy and replication for key data like Active Directory, it gets replicated in real time. Daily backups for things like router configs. They have a whole business continuity and disaster recovery manual that they review and test annually. And really importantly, they do annual restore tests from their backups.
To make sure they actually work.
Exactly. A backup isn't useful if you can't restore from it.
Yeah. Looking at all this detail, this operational rigor.
Mm-hmm.
What really jumps out at you as essential for building that kind of resilience?
I think it's the cadence, the constant review and verification. It's not just set it and forget it. Quarterly access reviews, quarterly risk reviews, biannual firewall audits, annual pen tests with follow-up, annual restore tests. It shows this continuous active effort.
It's diligence.
It's diligence across every layer, from the top leadership down to the nitty-gritty tech configs. That's where resilience really comes from, that ongoing practice and checking.
You know, speaking of CISOs and the critical role they play in setting up and maintaining these kinds of robust security practices we've just been discussing, we should definitely thank our sponsor again.
Yeah.
This deep dive wouldn't be possible without www.comarketplace.com.
Absolutely. So let's tie these two threads together now. We've got the testing of plans through simulations, and we've got these detailed security controls forming the operational foundation.
Right, because like we said, the best plan is useless if the systems are down or compromised. And the most secure systems don't help much if people don't know what to do in a crisis.
And that U.S. Signal SOC2 report, it actually makes the connection explicit. Under one of the controls, CC 7.5.2, it specifically says they do annual testing of their incident response plan using tabletop exercises and simulations.
Ah, there it is.
And this is key. The lessons learned from those exercises, they're used to update the procedures.
So that's the loop. You build the secure systems, write the plans based on those systems, practice executing the plans with simulations or TTXs, you verify the controls are working through audits and ongoing tests, and you feed what you learn from the practice runs back into making the plans better, maybe even tweaking the controls.
Exactly. It's not static. Preparedness, security, they're ongoing jobs. Simulations find the gaps, especially in coordination or understanding. Action plans fix those gaps. Regular monitoring and audits confirm the tech is working. And broader assessments, like that resilience program maturity assessment service PreparedX mentioned, help you see the bigger picture and improve over time.
It really is a continuous cycle. Plan, practice, verify, improve. Plan, practice, verify, improve.
That cycle is what builds real resilience. It's what takes you from just having a plan to actually being able to execute it effectively when things are chaotic, because the systems are reliable and the people have rehearsed.
Yeah, absolutely. So wrapping up, we've really dug into how organizations use structured simulations to test their readiness, going through those phases from goals to action plans. And we've looked under the hood at a real company to see those layers of security controls and operational practices, access controls, encryption, change management, constant testing that form the foundation for any successful response. It's all about that loop. Plan, practice, refine.
Building confidence through competence, really, not just hoping for the best.
Okay, so thinking about everything we've covered, the process for realistic simulations, the depth of technical and procedural controls needed, the absolute necessity of testing and learning, what aspect of building this kind of resilience do you think gets missed most often? And based on what we've seen, what's maybe one practical thing an organization could do better?
That's a tough one, but a good one. I suspect often it's the integration between different teams during a crisis. The tech team might be great at fixing the technical problem, the security team great at incident response steps. But how does that coordinate smoothly with communications, legal, maybe executive decision-making, talking to customers or regulators? That cross-functional coordination, the messy human part, can break down.
Ah, the seams between the silos.
Exactly. So maybe one practical step, building on what we discussed about TTXs. Move beyond just testing one department's plan in isolation. Invest in tabletop exercises that deliberately bring those different groups, IT, security, legal, comms, leadership together in the same scenario to specifically stress test those coordination points and communication flows. That's often where the real weaknesses hide.
That's a fantastic point. Stress test the seams. A great thought to leave everyone with. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive into resilience. We really hope you found some valuable insights.